keep a flexible mindset and how to make sure that you're as ready for test day as you can be when you sit for that exam. So just a little bit of background is I took the LSAT for the first time in November. I knew that I wasn't ready for it. I had started taking practice tests in October. And so I was where you guys were at. I was choosing to, I'm a Canadian, so I did apply this, I guess, this coming cycle or for admission in fall 2021. And so for me, it was November or January. I couldn't take it past January because that was my cutoff. But all the same, I chose to sit for November to get the experience. And I'm glad that I did because I really couldn't have imagined the nerves that I would feel. And not to say that you'll feel that, but that was just my experience. And then I did really poorly and I sat again in January, 2 months later, and improved by 8 points. So while I didn't get the score that I was practicing at prior to test day, I feel very proud of my score in that. I think 8 points is a good improvement. So yeah. Okay. So firstly, here are my tips. Simulate test day as closely as possible. Practice a flexible mindset, and I'll define what that means in this presentation. Find a study group. I recognize that some of you are pretty close to your LSAT dates, and so that might not be an option for you, but if it is, I would highly encourage you to do that. And Steve's classes are a great platform to do that. Fourth is habitualize studying, and we'll get into like habits and what I mean by habit building in the presentation. And then fifth is track your results. If you don't get up till 11 a.m., do not schedule your test time for 10 a.m. And so things like that. So recognize when you feel awake, recognize when you're most productive, and recognize, little things like whether you'd eat before the test, what habits do you do in the mornings that, you probably want to continue on test day, things like that. I think that they really matter. And now we have the wonderful opportunity of being able to simulate all of this, whereas before we wouldn't have been able to. So that's just on simulating test day. Practicing a flexible mindset. So I really firmly believe that the LSAT is a way of thinking. And in fact, while I'm hopefully done studying at this point, if I had to retake it, I can't say I'd be like, I'd be disappointed if I had to retake it, don't get me wrong, but I actually really like the LSAT and what it's taught me. So in terms of the way of thinking, so, I think that when we make mistakes or when you get a logical reasoning question wrong, if you're tracking what you're getting wrong, sometimes you'll often find that it's the same mistake over and over and over again. And it's a way of thinking. For me, I didn't realize until the LSAT how quick I was to jump to assumptions or to generalize statements. And the LSAT is not conducive to that way of thinking. So I really had to narrow in, read slowly, read carefully, make sure that I wasn't making assumptions. And so that kind of, I think, awareness helped me improve my scores, especially in logical reasoning. For reading comp, at first when I was studying, I never eliminated answer choices because I thought that seemed counterintuitive to saving time. I thought like eliminating answer choices just like would be a waste of time. But in fact, I actually was able to speed up in reading comp, and in the end was finishing before I was really struggling to finish sections. And by the end, I was finishing sections, not with extra time, but quite comfortably. I also, as part of that flexible mindset, started developing a different strategy for dual passages, which if any of you struggle with dual passages, I can speak to a bit. But just recognizing that the way that I thought about those passages and the way that I read them had to be different than the way I read a single passage. So in terms of finding a study group, I'll just speak to how that enhanced my studying. So firstly, from an accountability standpoint, finding a study group made me more accountable, especially on types of questions or parts of my studying that I really just didn't want to do, maybe because I was struggling with it, maybe because it was my least favorite part. But, with reading comp, for an example, I really didn't start deep diving into why I got certain questions wrong until I joined my study group. And they were able to point out, like, hey, you know what? Like, that was totally the wrong comprehension of what that passage was saying, or that's where this detail is in that passage. And you jumped and made an inference somewhere else, and that's why you got it wrong. So from an accountability standpoint, it really helped me. And at the beginning, I think in November, we were meeting like 2 or 3 times a week. But by the end, we were meeting every day. Not that I'm saying you have to do that. I'm just saying that's what happened to me. So the second piece was just having a second perspective. So I really learned a lot from my study group, because while I had a strong suit in, I can't remember now, but maybe at the end it was like necessary assumption questions. My study buddies might have had strong suits in strengthen or weakening questions. And, to some extent, each logical reasoning question has a little bit of a different, you have to take a little bit of a different strategy to it. And so that helped me. The third piece was support. So the LSAT is a very difficult test. And many of you, as we saw in the beginning, are, encountering the same challenges right now of whether to delay test your test date or what to do. And so those kinds of things, having a support group for me really helped overcome those challenges that really make you feel alone during this test and make it a lot more stressful than it needs to be. The fourth is back to what I was saying before, is just checking whether you truly understand the questions you get wrong. So it's easy, I find, in your studying to go through your review and be like, oh yeah, I got that question wrong. I understand why I got it wrong. But if you're in your study group and they're asking you why you got that question wrong, and they got it right, they're not going to let you, just breeze through it. And so I found that it helped me be more diligent with my studying. Okay, so habit building is something that I think I spoke on in my first TA session. But what I mean by that is I really believe that under a lot of stress or a lot of anxiety, we default to our habits. And for better or for worse on the LSAT, that meant for me that on test day, I defaulted to the lower end of my average score, which I expected. But really what that means is you have to be very diligent in setting habits. And so for logical reasoning questions, for an example, I can provide you more clarity later on the presentation, but I had a set system and approach for every single question type. And every single time I got a question wrong, I rewrote that process. And so for me, that really helped me habitualize my approach towards every single question and really cemented that process. And if I was starting to plateau or I was consistently getting one type of question wrong, to me, that showed me that I needed to change my process. So consistency was a really good thing for me in terms of improving my score. And yeah, just in terms of I guess, maintaining your commitment standpoint, things like studying at the same time every day can make it quite easy to make sure that you never miss time studying. So if you're studying at I studied at the same time from like 10, I was in like 2 classes last term because I'm still in school, but I studied from like 10 a.m. to 4. And I knew that that's what I was doing Monday through Friday. And so it was easy for me because there was no other, it was habitualized at that point. Like, what you're doing from that time. And so maybe that isn't that time for you. Maybe you guys have 3 hours, but if you know that every evening you're going to sit down from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and study, over time, it doesn't like tempt you if something's going on that night or you don't feel like studying. I'll do my best to check the chat. It wasn't quite 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. It was like, I don't know. It really depended, usually like 10 to 3:30. And then I'd meet with my study group in the evenings. Steve recommends 6 hours a day. That's a very personalized thing. I definitely found at the beginning, I wasn't able to study for as long, but towards the end I was. So tracking your progress, tracking my progress became very important towards the end because I could tell when I was starting to plateau on certain sections, or if I, did really poorly on a section or did way below my average, I could look back at my spreadsheet and say, okay, well, that, I don't need to get discouraged, because at the end of the day, where I was maybe -7 today, 4 days prior, I was -5 or something like that. And so, yeah, tracking your progress can keep you really motivated, because on really bad days, you remember that those don't have to always happen. And on really good days, you realize what you're capable of, and you have a new average to aim for. So I'll just speak to a little bit what my review process looked like personally. And I realize this isn't the best image, so I can share my screen on the Excel sheet directly if that's easier. But this was my Excel sheet that I used for reading comp passages. So I started, for every single reading comprehension question that I got wrong, I labeled the PT, the passage number, the question number, and then I would go through the passage again, write the main point. If it was a dual passage, I can go into what that strategy was, but I'll just stick to single passages right now. And then after I was done reading the main point, I'd read the passage again and break down the structure of the passage by paragraph number. And then after that, I used the LSAT trainer to label the question type, which I think Steve has a different way of labeling the question types. I think he calls them like global, local, and detail or specific or something like that. You have to find what works for you, of course. But for me, using the different question types in the LSAT trainer helped me almost think about reading comprehension as an extension of logical reasoning. And then I would start analyzing the answer choices and go into the correct, try and explain the correct answer, and then reflect on why the wrong answer was incorrect. And on questions where I had a lot of troubles doing that, I would just color code it and I would bring it up during my study group. For logical reasoning, I took a very similar approach, but as I mentioned before, and not only did I note the question type in my review process, but I wrote my approach. So for weekend, every single time I got a weekend question wrong, I would rewrite, identify the argument, determine the reasoning, and then and then my third piece of that is what change in this it's been a while. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so I guess with weaken is you can provide alternative evidence that would weaken the relationship between the conclusion and the reasoning, or you can directly not attack, but weaken the argument as it exists. So then after that, I would paraphrase the conclusion that I read from the stimulus, I would paraphrase the reasoning, and then I would go into my analysis. So I see there's questions on the chat. Okay, I can definitely share my approach to dual passages, because that's actually all I had for my presentation. I wanted to keep it quite short in case you guys wanted to ask questions. The writing section, I can just address that quickly while I pull up my reading comprehension sheet. The writing section is a section that you do whenever you'd like after you've taken the LSAT, and it's 35 minutes, and they give you a prompt and you just have to make an argument. There's not much I can speak to. It's not a graded section of the LSAT, but sometimes law schools will refer to it as a writing sample. Was there any other questions?
Hey, Gabby.
Enter. This is one of my study buddies. So yeah, if anybody has questions for my study buddy, please also ask.
No, I have a question for you. How did you manage burnout?
How did I manage burnout? Okay, so that's a very good question, because that is another reason why you should track your progress. Personally, I started noticing burnout if I started doing consistently poorly on a section. So like in logical reasoning, for an example, if I was getting like all of a sudden I was going from -4, -5 to like -7, -8 3 times in a row, like something's up. And honestly, some days I just like take 3 days off from logical reasoning and practice reading comprehension or logic games. So I think it's really important to stay mindful of where you're at and whether you're overthinking things, and just like keep in mind the big picture so you can manage burnout.
Awesome advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had another question actually for you. This is Jocelyn here. Um, so in terms of like study groups, um, you talked about how you were in a study group that met every day, right? And I was wondering, so like what were you looking in a study group to help keep you accountable? I find that at times, like if I am in a study group and I am with people that know more than me, it's definitely helpful. But I also recognize too that like, well, I don't want to say that it's intimidating, but it's like, oh my goodness, like I'm having to definitely reach and push myself to, I guess, reach a certain bar, I guess, in my head.
Mhm.
Um, so I was wondering, how did you like deal with that? And how did you, balance the study group life with your own personal study?
Yeah, good question. So I guess I'll go with the intimidation bit first. So when I started studying with Ayaka, actually was the first person that was in well, we were in the same study group, and then later, another girl who's another TA actually joined. But at first, when I joined the study group, Ayaka was like this reading comprehension queen, and I felt so behind her. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I worried about pushing her. I worried about whether I was able to keep up. I worried about whether I could get to the same level. But at the end of the day, you know what? Like, I think that when you go through this test and you're all putting in a lot of effort and you really care about improving, that shows. And so even if I wasn't at the same level as her, um, I still felt like pushed by her, and I still felt like I could push the conversation, because if I got a question wrong, and I asked her to explain it, it made her go back and double check, her thought process in that question. And then I guess balancing the study schedule with my personal schedule. So we all had our own personal schedules, and then we had the same structure for our study sessions generally. So we would go through a reading comprehension passage together. We'd do all the questions. We'd go back to questions that any of us got wrong. And then for logical reasoning, it was more like we'd bring up any questions that we had troubles with that day. But Ayaka, what's your perspective on that question?
Hey, Gabby. I think, you know, we all start at different levels. And, when I first started, I was knee deep in RC. So it probably felt like to Gabby, I was a lot more into that. But what Gabby said about having to explain the choices that I made, in answering a question, that made my like understanding of the questions and the answers better. So asking questions is really not a bad thing to do there, and it sort of balanced out at some point. In the first couple of weeks we were balancing each other out, and then it was like, okay, to take it to the next level, what do we need to do? So I think occasionally we had that like connection point of, okay, I think we understand the passages better. How do we get more accuracy out of what we're discussing? So I wherever you start might be kind of here and there. Like I was definitely behind Gabby in terms of logical reasoning. So at some point we kind of balanced out there, but I think that at some point you're going to balance out. And then the next step from there is going to be, how can we excel more? So I wouldn't be afraid to partner with someone that's, more knowledgeable, or might be better at something, because, asking questions can give you a lot of insight.
Mhm. Any other questions? Oh, chat.
I have
Thanks.
one more.
Yeah.
Gabby, is there anything you would tell yourself from the past when you first started taking the LSAT? Like, is there something that you would give if you could go back in time and give yourself an advice, what advice would that be? Like when you first started, from like today to like when you first started studying for the LSAT?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah, good question. Honestly, so I run in my spare time. That's kind of my like outlet for stress relief. I just really love running. Um, and so I would tell myself to think about the LSAT like running. So I would never try and run like 15 kilometers, 10 miles every day for like a week straight because I'd be tired. And I also wouldn't expect on the 7th day of that week that after running 10 miles every day, that I would, run my fastest time. And so I think that why I use that analogy is because the LSAT is very much a process. It's a way of thinking. So it's going to be up and down, and your progress is going to take like a lot of twists and turns, and that's okay. That's normal, in fact. And also, I think that I would have given myself more time. So had I thought about it like a process, I wouldn't have gone into it thinking I'm going to crank this test out in 2 months. I'm going to get the score I want. I'm going to be done with it. Like, it's not like a normal test. It's not like school where you can just study really hard and do well on that test. It's very much a way of thinking, which takes time to change. So I would analogize it to running for that reason.
Thank you.
Anything else, guys?
There's a question in the chat.
Oh my gosh, wait, dang it. How did you prepare the day before test day? Let me recenter. Yeah, okay, I can picture it. So the day before test day, I'll be totally honest. So when I took the January LSAT, that was the first week I started school. So I was really stressed out and I was like kind of disoriented. And prior to that week, I had actually had like a mini freak out, which is why study buddies are really important. So I was like, oh my gosh, guys, I just took a PT and it went so much worse than all my other PTs. And I was like, I've never taken 3 PTs in a week before. What do you think I should do? I don't want to feel like less confident before test day. And I don't want that test to be my last test before I take the test, the real thing. And they were like, you know what? If you're not, if you've got the energy and you've got the time, why not just take a second, like a third test, even though you've never done it before? Like, it might help you feel more confident. And I listened to them and I'm so glad that I did. And so that was my week before test day. So it wasn't like an ideal scenario by any means. And then the day before I took my test, I think I did this drill in the loophole. I think it's called like the basic training drill. Basically, it's just like you read a stimulus, an LR stimulus really slowly, and then you paraphrase it in your own words. So I did like that drill. I did probably an RC passage, I did a few logic games, I think, and then I did like a few logical reasoning questions. I think Steve recommends like taking the whole day off, but personally, I just wasn't comfortable with that, so I didn't. So that's what I did. It was lighter than I would have done for sure. Like, it was a very light study session, but it kept the LSAT juices flowing.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.